Well, good morning, everyone. Let me just say what an honor it is to be amongst all of you. So the title of my project is Transformative Relationships, Subnational Governments and Economic Upgrading in India. So this project is a spin-off from a book project that I won't tell you how long I've been working on that book project, but it's more than I care to contemplate. But anyway, that project is almost complete, and it looks at many of these upgrading and industrial policy questions in India, France, and also in a cross-national quantitative setting. But with this project that I'm going to present today, what I want to do is take the issue of subnational governments and also local governments and the relationships between the center, subnational, and various tiers of subnational governments more seriously in trying to explore how upgrading an industrial policy works. And so the idea here is essentially to look at something which I think has received not nearly enough attention in the literature on industrial policy and upgrading, which is, what is the role of subnational governments in this? And how can upgrading policy actually function in decentralized systems? Because we often think of it as kind of a top-down sort of policy arrangement that we associate with central planning, let's say. So with that in mind, the project, as I said, explores the role of subnational governments in promoting upgrading and in tackling what's often called the middle income trap, which has taken on the form of a crisis in many countries. As I said, some scholars have alleged that highly decentralized democracies are at a disadvantage in developing and implementing upgrading and industrial policy. But I argue here that when certain conditions are met, decentralized democracies are actually in an especially strong position to implement what I call a pluralist form of upgrading policy. And this is a form that takes advantage of the strengths of both central and subnational governments, rather than being a more top-down sort of upgrading or industrial policy. And so I test my arguments, and this is very preliminary, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback with an internally comparative case study of the state of Bihar. Okay, if you could advance. Okay, so just a little bit of background. So successful upgrading generally involves building linkages between domestic firms, governments, financial institutions, research institutions, and so forth to help businesses consistently innovate in their technology and in their processes. Another kind of modern aspect of upgrading, which is somewhat different from what it was kind of in the post-war heyday of industrial policy, is that now we have global value chains. So upgrading policy has taken on a more international or global character. And it involves today efforts to secure the most beneficial role for a country's firms in the international production of specific goods and services, which are now generally produced, different elements of the value chain actually occur in different countries now, oftentimes. Next slide. So as scholars have long understood, upgrading policy is extraordinarily complex. So in the words of Peter Evans, who's one of obviously the central scholars of this area, it requires that government officials be embedded enough in the private sector in order to know what the private sector needs in order to upgrade, but also autonomous enough from the private sector to be able to discipline firms which do not kind of live up to their objectives, and seek to take advantage of government support and government largesse to collect rents. So embedded autonomy is kind of the term that he identified for what produces upgrading. The other complex element of upgrading, as those of you who have studied it know, or industrial policy more broadly, is that it can make use of a wide variety of policy tools. So usually in economics, of course, we think about different policy areas as being associated with different policy tools: trade policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and so forth. The complicated thing about industrial policy is that any of these individual policy tools can actually be used to promote upgrading or to promote specific industries. And so we define industrial policy more by the intent of the policy than by the particular policy instruments. And that intent is typically microeconomic, meaning that it's the identification of particular firms that the state believes ought to be supported in order to move the entire economy up the value chain. When industrial policy happens, we have governments, and in a number of forms, autonomous bureaucracies, line ministries, and as I would argue, also subnational governments, use these variety of tools. They could be trade protection, they could be investment guarantees, they could be subsidies, they could be cheap credit, they could be even, softer policy tools of bringing together different actors through a networking system in order to support domestic firms as they innovate, while also holding them accountable for a lack of progress. Due to the complexity of upgrading, many researchers, most notably Danny Roderick, have emphasized that a single policy formula is not likely to work in all times and places. Next slide, please. So frequently, upgrading policies are thought to be effective only in countries with a cohesive central leadership that can oversee the development and implementation of a national plan. Such a national plan is understood to represent a coordinated vision of how to promote. I think we're on the wrong slide, or I think I missed. Sorry, I need new glasses. Could you advance one more slide? There we go. That's where I am. Okay. Such a national plan is often understood to represent a coordinated vision of how to promote upgrading, one which can then be implemented in a centralized fashion. What's received quite a lot of less attention is the idea that subnational and even local governments can be involved in an upgrading or industrial policy process. If kind of the general understanding of a more centralized form of upgrading policy is correct, federal and also strongly decentralized countries operate under a serious disadvantage in promoting upgrading. But does decentralization really mean that effective upgrading policy is difficult or impossible? Kind of a cliffhanger for the next slide, so if you could advance to the next slide. In this project, I argue that decentralized countries can indeed develop and implement effective upgrading policies, often more effective than those observed in top-down regimes. But these policies will differ both in form and substance as a result of the deep involvement of regional and subnational governments. I identify here a series of characteristics that I think must be present for upgrading policy in decentralized democracies to be maximally effective. Next slide. When these are present, upgrading takes place in what I would call a pluralist rather than a more centralized, or one might say corporatist fashion, with multiple tiers and branches of government interacting separately with multiple different private actors. There may still be a national plan, but the plan would potentially be a dead letter, or it might be produced through a more cooperative form of federalism where local and subnational governments are more present, or it might address industries at a more national scale. The pluralist approach to upgrading, and this is drawing a little bit from the varieties of capitalism literature, I would argue is not as effective as a more centralized approach in large-scale structural adjustment, large-scale transformation of the economy, but it can be extremely effective at smaller scale upgrading across a wide variety of large and smaller industries, more incremental sorts of upgrading. Next slide, please. So what are the conditions for success? I argue here that what's critical is the right structure of policy making. So my focus here is not on what the policy ought to be, because I think the prior literature has established fairly well that correct policies differ in many cases depending on particular circumstances. So instead I'm focused much more on the structure of policy making. And this is manifested in two sorts of institutions. Upgrading institutions, which formulate and implement policies, and these are actually physical institutions that you might identify on paper, for example, MITI in Japan, or the NITI Aayog here in India. They might, but in addition to upgrading institutions, we also have to recognize the importance of what I call upgrading coalitions. And these are critical actors that stand behind upgrading institutions. Upgrading coalitions are more informal groups of actors. These might include leadership at the central and subnational government levels, They might include business associations, major corporate leaders. They might include major universities that stand behind upgrading and are committed to kind of a common vision of upgrading. And when these kind of critical stakeholders are aligned and cooperating, then they stand behind the institutions that actually undertake the policies. When both state and private actors have an incentive to cooperate in these institutions, upgrading policy will be more effective. By contrast, when government actors have an upper hand, policymaking is inefficiently statist, I argue, whereas when private actors are dominated, it's often captured and used for rents. So some sort of a balance of power between government actors and private actors is necessary for this to be effective. Within the context of highly decentralized democracies, then when are beneficial state and private relationships most likely to be observed? I would argue that in these settings, the national government is not in a position to formulate and carry out upgrading policy without including regional governments. And this is because regional governments in decentralized systems generally control significant policy and financial resources that play a role in upgrading policy, including oftentimes certain regulatory policies. More than that, regional governments are in the best position to interact with firms based in their locales at a grassroots level. In other words, they're more likely to possess high-quality information about their operations. They're more likely to be embedded in those institutions. At the same time, regional governments need the resources that national governments generally command. And they also may require national policy coordination that can only be done from the capital. In addition, some firms and business associations may be large enough to operate nationally, and therefore it might make sense for the central government to focus on supporting these large industries. Next slide, please. So what are the conditions? And maybe I shouldn't have said, maybe conditions is too grandiose. Really, it's more, these are 5 things that I believe, when they are present, will produce better outcomes. First is better outcomes will be achieved when both national and regional governments enjoy high capacity and are incentivized to have long time horizons. In the democratic context, long time horizons might be generated by a stable party system, low levels of electoral volatility, and a high capacity and effective bureaucratic structure. Next slide, please. Number 2? Yeah. Oh, next slide, sorry. There you go. National and regional governments, it'll work better, in other words, when national and regional governments are incentivized to work together to promote upgrading. This might be more likely when they are controlled by the same party, but it could also occur when the regional power of subnational government leaders nevertheless ensures them a critical place in upgrading coalitions. Next slide. Okay. Third condition, upgrading policy will work better when when the upgrading system operates according to the broad principle of subsidiarity. In this context, the principle would mean that small or regional firms and industries interact primarily with regional governments, state governments in the Indian case, whereas very large national firms and highly organized industries might interact primarily with the central government. The central and regional government would then share resources and information where needed. Next slide. The fourth would be that relevant private actors, especially firms, as I said, are neither too powerful to dominate the central or regional government with which they interact, nor so fragmented that they can be fully dominated. Indeed, the fact that differently scaled firms and industries can interact with different tiers of government is among the strongest benefits of decentralized regimes and upgrading. And then finally, since some regions will begin with a stronger base to promote upgrading, the central government would need to use the tax system and other forms of central power in order to promote some degree of equalization so that upgrading can occur effectively in poorer parts of the country. Okay, next slide. So I undertake this is very preliminary, case study of Bihar to kind of explore some of these issues. It's more of a plausibility probe. How much time do I have? I'm sorry. 2 minutes. Okay, I'll do it real fast. To ensure the variation on my primary independent variables, I evaluate upgrading policy in Bihar internally comparative case before and after 2005 when Nitish Kumar and the JDU took power in the state, and before and after the BJP's capture of the center in 2014. So I'm able to look at before and after a more developmentalist government took power in the state, and I'm also able to look at how that developmentalist government interacted both with a central government with which it was aligned and a central government with which it wasn't aligned. So looking at each of the five, the first one, both national and regional governments enjoy high capacity and long time horizons. We know that under Nitish Kumar and the JDU, the Bihari party system is stabilized to a significant degree, so the effective number of parties, according to a prior project that I undertook with Shyam Banerjee, we did some calculations across all the Indian states, and the effective number of parties dropped from 4.6 in 2000 to 2.7 in 2014. The electoral volatility, which is the percentage of seats that change parties from election to election, dropped from 66.5 in 2000 to 27.2 in 2014. Kumar also launched a series of administrative reforms to strengthen the state bureaucracy. And of course, as we know, Bihar famously increased its growth rate dramatically during this time, which provides some preliminary evidence for the argument. Next slide. Okay, the second one is the one that explores the incentives of national and regional governments to work together to promote upgrading. First, it's fair to point out that the replacement of the Planning Commission with the Niti Aayog may produce more opportunities for coordination. And you know, I don't have any definitive findings on this one yet, but I would just say that the theory would expect that when the JDU was a member of the NDA coalition at the center and that coalition was in power, we would expect more effective cooperation between the state government in Bihar and the central government in Delhi. Whereas when it was out of alignment, for example, when Kumar pulled out of the NDA between 2013 and 2017, and just, I think last month, he's just again pulled out of the NDA. So we might expect, you know, more conflictual relationships between the state and the center. Next slide. The third one looks at subsidiarity. And here the theory would predict that Bihar's government would interact, if it's to be most effective, would interact primarily with smaller firms and coordinate its actions towards larger firms with the central government. So I don't have good findings here, and I'd be interested in your views, but I think you know, if the theory is right that this is effective, then we would expect some sort of cooperation between center and state. Next slide. So the fourth is the one about the alignment in power and influence between firms and the state. And here the theory would predict a pluralist form of upgrading where both the center and the state, as well as individual actors within each, interact with firms to promote the development of new technology and processes. Upgrading success would not involve fundamental economic transformation, but rather incremental but real improvements. So that's kind of the expectation, that this is the way that upgrading policy would work in a modern decentralized India, and that it would be most effective with more incremental transformation. Next slide. And then the final condition that I identified was that since some regions begin with a stronger base to promote upgrading, that the central government should use the tax system or other powers to promote some degree of equalization. And here we know that the Kumar government has long insisted that Bihar be given special status with respect to central transfers, and the denial of this is actually the proximate cause of Nitish Kumar's pulling out of the NDA just this year. More broadly, central transfers as well as central upgrading efforts don't even come close to compensating for the vast differences in capacity among India's states. So here we would probably expect to see less effective outcomes because the equalization grants are not, or the vertical fiscal system is not equalizing adequately. So I will leave the conclusions for you to read because I've already kind of hit on all those points. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pity we don't have more time, but it's a very fascinating project that you have outlined. And before we throw the floor open for discussions, I'd just like to draw attention to one or two things. One is, of course, the case studies came later and you're still working on them. The periods you've chosen, 2004 to 14 and 14 to 22, I think you need to see during what length of time what you call alignment or disalignment, what I would say is talked about in the political parlance, is the double-engine government or the double-brake government, which means that you can have a double-engine government, but you can also have a double-brake government, which means the center is holding you back and its agents in the state, possibly the governor, is also supplementing that. So that's a crucial question because the two states that you've mentioned. The other thing is on state capacity or state capability. I think there's an excellent new book on this by Somanathan and Natarajan, Oxford University Press, where the question of whether the state has the capacity or not is largely dependent on who decides whether it has the capacity or not. Because if the decider has a vested interest in finding that the state doesn't have capacity, then obviously you're going to have a situation where thinking for the state will be done at other levels. So I mean, do have some indicators of measuring capacity, but there's that subjective level of being told you may match certain criteria, but no, you don't have capacity. So I think you could look into that. Harrier, yours.
Okay, now it's a session for Q&A.